My name is Bianca, and I'm 32 years old. 3 days after I gave birth to twins, my whole world collapsed in a single afternoon, and then quietly, I rebuilt it from the rubble while everyone else was still celebrating what they thought was their victory. I had been in that hospital bed for 72 hours. My body felt like it had been through a war, because honestly it had. Twin pregnancies are not gentle. The delivery had been long and complicated, and I had barely slept since the moment my son Leo and my daughter Nora came into this world. They were small and perfect, and completely unaware of the storm that was already gathering around them. I remember lying there, one baby on each arm, thinking that whatever I had suffered to get to that moment had been worth every second. I was wrong to think the suffering was over.
Welcome back to Drama Tales Daily, where the quiet ones rebuild, while the world watches. If you've ever been underestimated when you were at your weakest, settle in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button. This one will stay with you. My husband Garrett had been at the hospital for the first day. He held the babies, took photographs, smiled for the nurses. But by the second morning, he had excuses: a work emergency, a call he couldn't miss, a meeting that apparently couldn't wait 3 days while his wife recovered from bringing 2 human beings into the world. I told myself it was stress. I told myself he was overwhelmed. I had been telling myself those kinds of stories for 2 years, which is how long I had been quietly noticing things I didn't want to name out loud. On the third day, I was alone in the room with Leo and Nora when the door opened. I expected a nurse. Instead, I got Garrett's mother, Sylvia.
Sylvia Hargrove was the kind of woman who made every room feel smaller, simply by walking into it. She was 71 years old, immaculately dressed even on a Tuesday afternoon, with a kind of composed expression that came from decades of getting exactly what she wanted. She had never liked me. She hadn't hidden it particularly well either. From the moment Garrett introduced us, she had looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't quite belong in the room. Politely tolerated, never accepted. Behind her walked a woman I had never seen before. She was younger than me, well put together, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already been told she'd won. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. I understood immediately who she was, what she was, and why she was standing in my hospital room 3 days after I had given birth. Sylvia set her handbag on the chair beside the door, and told me, without any warmth and without any hesitation, that Garrett had been with this woman. Her name was Celeste, for 14 months. She said it the way someone reads a weather report. Factual, unbothered. She then told me that Garrett wanted a divorce, that he wanted to move forward with Celeste, and that the family had discussed the matter and reached a decision about how it should be handled. Then she placed a document on my bedside table. Divorce papers already prepared, already filled in with numbers and terms that someone with a team of lawyers had spent real time constructing. And beside it she placed a single sheet with a figure printed at the top. $22 million. A settlement. Clean and final, and designed to make me go away quickly. She told me to take the money and sign. She told me Garrett only wanted the children. I looked at Leo. I looked at Nora. They were asleep. Both of them completely peaceful with no understanding of what was being said 3 feet above their heads. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because I think people expect a story like this to have a dramatic reaction. Screaming, crying, throwing things. What I actually felt was something much quieter, and much more dangerous. It was clarity. A door in my mind swung open, and behind it was every moment I had ignored, every excuse I had made, every time I had shrunk myself down to make Garrett's world more comfortable. And standing on the other side of that door was a version of me that was done shrinking. I looked at Sylvia. I looked at Celeste. Then I looked back at the papers, and I signed them. Sylvia's expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of satisfaction, of relief, of a woman who had just gotten what she came for. She picked up the documents, nodded at me once like I was a transaction that had been completed, and turned toward the door. She had no idea what I had just set in motion. If your blood is boiling right now, drop a FLE in the comments. Drama Tales Daily, where the underestimated finally strike back. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The real story starts now. What Sylvia didn't know, what Garrett didn't know, what none of them had bothered to find out in 14 months of planning this, was who I actually was before I became Garrett's wife. Before I took his last name and moved into his family's world, and let myself be made invisible. Before I became the woman in the hospital bed they were so confident they could simply buy and dispose of. They knew the version of me I had allowed them to see. They did not know about the version of me that had spent 8 years building something quietly and carefully and completely on my own. They didn't know about the accounts, the holdings, the network I had maintained in silence. They didn't know that the moment I signed those papers, I hadn't surrendered. I had just freed both hands. That night, while Sylvia went home satisfied and Garrett presumably celebrated with Celeste, I made 3 phone calls from that hospital room, with Leo and Nora asleep beside me. By morning, I had already begun the process of making sure that everything Sylvia Hargrove had spent her life building would be balanced. Every cent, every asset, every advantage she thought was untouchable. Down to 0. I was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday morning. No husband waiting at the entrance, no flowers, no car seat installed by someone who loved me. Just me, a nurse pushing my wheelchair, and 2 car seats I had asked my friend Rosalind to bring the night before. Rosalind didn't ask questions. She just showed up with coffee, the car seats, and the kind of steady presence that only a real friend can offer when your life is actively on fire. She loaded Leo and Nora into her car while I walked myself to the passenger seat, and we drove away from that hospital without me looking back once. What I had set in motion the night before was already running. If you're still with me, drop a vol in the comments. Drama Tales Daily, where mothers become warriors. Subscribe for the takedown. Before I explain what I did, I need to explain something about Sylvia Hargrove's fortune, because understanding what she had built is the only way to understand how precisely I was able to dismantle it. Sylvia controlled the Hargrove family holdings through a private trust structure her late husband Reginald had established decades ago. On paper, the trust was airtight. In practice, it had one significant vulnerability. It had been managed lazily for years by a firm that prioritized stability over scrutiny. Nobody had looked hard at the underlying assets in a very long time. I had, quietly. Over 18 months. Before I married Garrett, I had spent 8 years working in private asset restructuring. I was not a lawyer. I was not a banker. What I was, specifically, was someone companies hired when they needed to understand exactly where value was hidden, where it was exposed, and how it could be moved or protected, or in the wrong hands, eroded completely. I was very good at my job. I had stopped working publicly when Garrett asked me to, which I now understood had been less about our relationship and more about keeping me occupied with domesticity while he built a parallel life with Celeste. The 3 phone calls I made from my hospital room were to 3 people I had worked with for years. A forensic accountant named Victor, a restructuring attorney named Philippa, and a former colleague named Desmond who now ran his own advisory firm and owed me a favor significant enough that he picked up on the first ring at 11 o'clock at night and simply said, "Tell me what you need." What I needed was a full audit trail on every asset connected to the Hargrove Trust, cross-referenced against the settlement agreement Sylvia's lawyers had prepared. Because here was the thing about that settlement. $22 million sounds like a large number until you understand what it was actually structured around. It was designed to transfer specific assets to me, while simultaneously shielding the larger holdings from any future claim. The people who wrote it were clever. They had just made one mistake. They had assumed I would take the number at face value, without reading what was underneath it. I had read everything. By the time Rosalind pulled into my driveway that Thursday morning, Victor had already identified 4 asset positions within the trust that had been misrepresented in the settlement documentation. Not fraudulently, carefully. The kind of careful that looks clean until someone who knows exactly what they're looking at spends 6 hours with the right software and the right access. Philippa had already filed a motion to pause the settlement finalization pending a full disclosure review. And Desmond had made 2 calls to institutional contacts whose relationships with the Hargrove family holdings were, it turned out, far more conditional than Sylvia had ever appreciated. Sylvia called Garrett at 9:17 that morning. I know this because Garrett called me at 9:21. And for the first time in 2 years, his voice had lost that particular smoothness he always used when he thought he was in control of a situation. He asked me what I had done. I told him I had simply asked for a complete and accurate picture of what I was signing. I told him that if the settlement had been prepared honestly, the review would find nothing and the process would continue without issue. I told him this very calmly from my kitchen while Rosalind fed Leo and I held Nora against my chest. He hung up without responding. If you're on the edge of your seat, drop a 4 in the comments. Drama Tales Daily, where the quiet ones dismantle empires. Subscribe for the finale. What the review found over the following 3 weeks was significant enough that Sylvia's legal team requested a meeting. Then they requested another one. Philippa attended both. I did not. By the end of the second meeting, the original settlement figure had become a starting point for a very different conversation, and the asset protection Sylvia had built into the original document had been systematically dismantled by the disclosure requirements Philippa had triggered. The final settlement was not $22 million. I won't give the exact number, because frankly it's not the point of this story. The point is that Sylvia Hargrove walked into my hospital room 3 days after I gave birth, and handed me what she believed was a transaction. A clean, final, humiliating transaction designed to buy my silence, separate me from my children, and return everything to the order she preferred. What she handed me instead was the last piece of information I needed to take apart everything she thought was protected. I kept both twins. I kept every right I came in with, and several more I hadn't had before. And Sylvia, for the first time in her life, discovered that the woman she had tried to erase had been paying far closer attention than anyone in that family had ever bothered to notice. Leo and Nora are asleep in the next room as I write this. They are safe, they are fed, and they are mine. That is all I ever needed it to come down to. If this ending moved you, drop a FYP in the comments. Drama Tales Daily, where mothers become unstoppable. Share this with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated when you were at your most vulnerable, hit that subscribe button and stay close. There are more stories like this coming, the kind that remind you the quiet ones are always paying attention. This is Drama Tales Daily. See you in the next story.